Welcome back to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we are going to be exploring the murder of Alexander Sandy McClelland, as he was known, who was discovered in very unusual circumstances in the boot of his own car in Brighouse, West Yorkshire in 1985. The murder of a 66-year-old man and the concealment of his body shocked the local community and had left everyone still wondering why did it happen and who could have done such a thing. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. Brighouse is a town located in West Yorkshire and part of the metropolitan borough of Calderdale. It is around 4 miles east of Halifax and was historically part of the West Riding of Yorkshire. It is a relatively small town that is served by both a railway line and the M62 motorway. In 1985, Brighouse was where 66-year-old Alexander McClelland, or Sandy as he liked to be known, lived. He had lived in many places around the UK by 1985. It's known that he spent many years in Edinburgh in Scotland before moving down south to Grantham and then up to Leeds and Brighouse. He lived quite a peaceful and quiet life in Brighouse, and it's reported that he lived in a flat on Willowgarth Road on the outskirts of town. Sandy lived alone, however he did have relatives nearby, his stepson Brian and his wife Elizabeth. They lived just around the corner from Sandy and saw him often. They would help him with his shopping and would meet him for a drink at the local pub. This was their usual routine on a Friday night, and Sandy would meet Brian and Elizabeth for a drink and a game of dominoes. It's reported on a 1985 Crimewatch Reconstruction that this is something that Sandy enjoyed doing. He was known to many of the patrons and staff at the pub as a regular. Apart from visiting his stepson and wife, however, Sandy did not socialise often, and liked keeping himself to himself. He was a well-liked person in the local community and enjoyed spending time with his family. This is why in the middle of September 1985, Brian and Elizabeth thought it was strange when they hadn't heard from Sandy. They would be in touch at least once a week when they visited the local pub, however they had not heard from him since Thursday the 12th of September when they had all been shopping together at the local Asda supermarket. This was not like Sandy and it concerned them. They also discovered that Sandy's green Ford Cortina was also missing from his flat, and this caused them to wonder where Sandy would have gone. Who reported Sandy's disappearance is not published in contemporary or recent articles on Sandy's case. However, I can speculate that it was Brian and Elizabeth, who were both close to Sandy and saw him on a regular basis. They would have obviously noticed his absence. The police quickly set about looking for Sandy, and crucially, they began trying to track down the Ford Cortina. They started by looking around the area of Brighouse in the hope that they may see it. At around 11:30 a.m. on the 7th of October, 26 days after Sandy had last been seen by Brian and Elizabeth, the police finally had a sighting of the green Ford Cortina. It was parked in what was called the Bethel car park in the centre of Brighouse. It was adjacent to the canal and the working men's social club called Wheelers. The police went out to the site where the car was found and began to process the interior. When they opened the boot, the detectives were met with a horrific and gruesome discovery. Inside was the body of Sandy McClelland. He had been wrapped in a bedsheet and had what looked like a balaclava over his head. On closer examination of the body, it was found that he had been stabbed. This was not the outcome that Sandy's family had hoped for, and they were devastated by his death. They could also not quite comprehend how this had happened to him, and most importantly, why. Sandy did not appear to have any enemies, and mostly kept to himself. So how had this happened to him? When police removed Sandy's body, they discovered another strange detail. He was wearing clothes, however they did not appear to be his. The trousers were around 4 inches too long for him, and it appeared that he had been put into someone else's clothes before being placed into the boot of the car. This was quite a baffling detail, and it posed a lot of questions for the detectives. Both Sandy's body and the items that were left in the car were sent for further forensic examination to see if they could give the detectives any more information. It was crucial that detectives gained some much-needed insight into Sandy's movements before his disappearance, and so they spoke to Brian and Elizabeth to try and establish what had been happening in Sandy's life. They spoke to detectives and explained that Sandy had been carrying out his usual routine, meeting them at the pub and going shopping with them. They did, however, tell police that something unusual had occurred the week before Sandy had disappeared. On the evening of the 5th of September, Brian and Elizabeth called around to Sandy's flat and discovered that he had a visitor. It was around 11:15 when they visited him on that Thursday evening and found that a man was staying overnight at his flat. Brian and Elizabeth found this strange, as Sandy did not regularly socialise with other people and would never normally let anyone stay at his home. Sandy introduced this man as Stuart and said that he had come to Leeds to look for a driving job. Brian and Elizabeth went on to explain that Sandy told them he had been in the pub with Stuart that evening as well. They gave a description of the man and said that he was around 30 years of age, was about 5'6" to 5'8" inches tall, and had sandy or light brown coloured hair. They also found out that evening from Stuart that he was separated from his wife and that he had 2 children. It stated on the Crimewatch Reconstruction that the detectives, although unsure if this man was connected to Sandy's disappearance, wanted to find out a little more about him. They explained that they began looking into any companies that may have took on someone or interviewed someone that fit that description around the time of the 5th or 6th of September. Brian and Elizabeth certainly did think it was strange that Sandy had allowed someone to stay with him, particularly someone that they had never seen before. Brian and Elizabeth also provided them with information about the last day that they saw Sandy before his disappearance. It was a week later, on Thursday the 12th of September. They explained that they went to Asda to get some shopping with Sandy that evening in his Ford Cortina. They also took their 16-year-old daughter Lynn and dropped her off on the way to the supermarket. Sandy was reportedly in good spirits and was making jokes as he went around the aisles. There was nothing that would suggest that there was anything wrong that night. They returned from the supermarket to Brian and Elizabeth's home, and Brian reported that he drove to the supermarket and back to his own home, where he and Elizabeth got out of the car with their shopping. This was around 8:10 p.m. Sandy told them that he had some heartburn and that he was going to have an early night. He took the keys back off Brian and got in the car to go home. Sandy drove off, but returned to Brian and Elizabeth's flat about 10 minutes later. He was returning some cigarettes to Brian that had been left in the car when he had got out. Brian thanked him and said goodnight to Sandy. This was around 8:20 p.m. Both Brian and Elizabeth and the police were unsure if Sandy had returned in his car to their flat or had walked. Therefore, they did not know how he had got back to his own home. It's worth noting that the flats were only round the corner from each other, and it was plausible that he could have done either of these things. This was the last known sighting of Sandy before his discovery in the boot, almost a month later. Despite the quite thorough recollection of Brian and Elizabeth that night, it's clear that there were still a lot of questions that needed answering. Had Sandy gone straight home after leaving Brian and Elizabeth? Had someone else seen him that night? Had his car been left in the Bethel car park on the 12th of September, or at a later time? Detectives looked closely at the location where the car had been left, and decided to appeal for witnesses at the Wheelers Social Club. The evening of the 12th of September had been a very busy one at the club, as they had several charity events on that night. The club had been full, and the police appealed for anyone that may have seen Sandy's car parked in the car park, or even just noticed anything suspicious that they believed would be important to the police. They also appealed to any shoppers who may have parked their car in the car park in the days after Sandy's disappearance. They hoped that they may have seen someone leaving the car, or just noticed that it was there on a certain day. The ambiguity around when the car was left in that location made it difficult for detectives to pinpoint when the crime had actually occurred. Detective Superintendent Ken Baines reiterated on the Crimewatch episode that they were very eager to speak to Stuart, who had been at Sandy's home the week before. The police had created an e-fit of the man in the hope that someone may recognise him, or that Stuart himself may see it and come forward. Detective Superintendent Baines also described some new evidence that had been found on some of the items that were with Sandy's body. The bedspread that he had been wrapped in was beige with brown and white lines along the bottom of it. By using the forensic technology that they had at the time, they'd been able to use cameras which brought to light a trademark stamp on the bedspread. This stamp showed that the bedspread had been made in 1961 for the British Army by a company that was located on the Lancashire-Yorkshire border. A small ticket was also found stapled to the bedspread. It was identified as a dry cleaning or laundry ticket of some description, and indicated that it had been taken into a laundrette not long before its use in the murder. D.S. Baines appealed for anyone that may work in the industry and who may recognise the laundry ticket to come forward to help the police. He also asked that anyone at all that could identify the ticket would be helpful in trying to solve this crime. Similar clothes to the ones that Sandy was found in were shown on a model to demonstrate that these were in fact not his clothes. D.S. Baines reiterated that he was wearing jeans that were 4 inches too long for him and a black medium-sized jumper. The one item of clothing that of course stood out to police was the khaki-coloured balaclava or head warmer that covered most of Sandy's face except his eyes. This was not something that detectives found on victims at many crime scenes, and it was important for the detectives to get as much information as they could about it. The headwear was sent for forensic analysis in the same way as the bedspread was, and they were also able to find a manufacturer's stamp. This established that, like the bedspread, the head warmer had been issued to the British Army and was made in 1952 by a company called W.H. White & Sons in Staffordshire. The police were able to establish that the company had manufactured 300,000 of the head warmers between 1952 and 1956. When it was being scientifically analysed, scientists could see something red with their usual lights in the lab. This was found to be red ink and looked as though it was a number that had been printed on it. It was put under a laser to further establish what, if anything, it may indicate. They discovered that it wasn't actually a number, but a name that was printed on it. The name Kellett appeared under the laser. This was of course a crucial clue, as it pointed to a name, perhaps of the person who owned this piece of clothing. The evidence appeared to indicate that whoever had murdered Sandy had either been in the army or had access to clothing from the army, perhaps from the household he lived in, or a friend or relative. The police thought it would be a huge coincidence for these two items to be in the boot together, if there was not some sort of army connection. On the Crimewatch episode, Detective Superintendent Baines also told the public that he had reason to believe that Sandy may have been gay, and that he could have links to the gay community. He did not elaborate on the evidence that he had to suggest this. However, he did appeal for anyone in that community to come forward if they knew Sandy or knew anything about the person who had committed this brutal crime. Despite the thorough forensic analysis of all the items found in Sandy's car, and speaking to those that knew him, the police unfortunately were no closer to discovering what had happened to him and who committed the murder. Sandy was not a high-risk victim that the police could understand. The way that he had been murdered and dumped made many people in the local community worry about what might happen next. The Crimewatch Reconstruction, while gaining several calls and tips, did not lead to any interviews or arrests. Sadly, in the years following Sandy's murder, nothing new was discovered that led to any progress being made in his case, and little has been published over those years to indicate if anything was being done after it was treated as a cold case. In 2017, however, there was a push on Sandy's case in the media, with West Yorkshire Police once again appealing to the public for information. As reported in the Examiner Live, the Detective Superintendent Dunkerley of the Protective Services Department at West Yorkshire Police stated, "It's now 32 years since Mr. McClelland was found, but the passage of time in no way diminishes our desire to achieve justice for the victim and for his family. We never close a case until the person or persons responsible have, wherever possible, been brought to justice. As part of our commitment to getting justice, we have a major investigation review team which is looking at every single murder committed in the West Yorkshire area for which no one has yet been brought to justice. The team is looking at any new lines of inquiry, for example advances in DNA technology that could help provide a vital breakthrough. I would also like to appeal directly to anyone who may hold information about this or any other unsolved murder in West Yorkshire to come forward and tell police what they know. This renewed investigation into Sandy's murder is a positive step in the right direction, and I'm sure much appreciated by his family and friends." So what did happen to Sandy McClelland? Something clearly happened to Sandy on the evening of the 12th of September 1985, after returning from the supermarket with his family. Brian and Elizabeth did not think he was behaving any differently than usual, and while he said he wanted an early night, this did not seem odd to them. Was he attacked while on his way home, or had someone been waiting for him to return that night? The fact that Sandy's clothing was missing is also an important detail, as perhaps this was done to remove evidence, as they would have been left stained with blood, and the perpetrator may have left some of his own DNA on there. Where had the clothing come from? Had the killer come prepared for this to happen, or did they have to think on their feet after the murder occurred? Sandy did do something unusual in the weeks leading up to his death, which was to invite someone to stay at his home. I think the fact that his family thought this was unusual behaviour should not be overlooked, and I definitely think Stuart should be a person of interest. Where had Sandy met him? Why had he agreed for him to stay at his home? There is of course no evidence that this man had anything to do with Sandy's murder. However, the fact that he had been inside Sandy's house and perhaps knew his routine should of course be of importance to the police. There is also the evidence that the items found in Sandy's boot had been made for the army. This indicates that someone with connections to the British Army may have been involved in the murder, or perhaps just someone who had access to these objects. They were manufactured quite a few years before Sandy's death, suggesting the person who owned them had had them for a while. I do think that Sandy's case is solvable, mainly because the initial investigation did uncover some important evidence, and the items of clothing should, if still in police custody, be able to provide some new leads using today's technology. I really do think using new forensic techniques and with the passage of time, new evidence may come to light to solve this case, and I hope that we can finally find out who killed Sandy McClelland. A killer has been on the streets for almost 35 years now, and it's important that we find out who it is and give Sandy and his family some closure. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can review us wherever you listen. Thank you to the Chip Fan for giving us a 5-star review this week, it's much appreciated. I would also like to thank our Patreon supporters for their amazing support. If you'd like to get stickers, shout-outs and bonus episodes, then have a look at the link in the show notes. I also have a YouTube channel where you can listen to the audio from each episode. If you think this is something you'd like to do, please subscribe if you get a minute. You can connect with me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram to talk about the cases, or just have a general chit-chat. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, please contact me on social media, or you can send me an email at theunseenpod@gmail.com. I hope everyone is keeping safe, and I'll be back with you next week for another episode. As always, I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.